Hello, everyone, and welcome to my home in Basel. Um, I wish, first of all, to thank the Boston Early Music Festival for this quite a unique opportunity. I'm very, very happy to have the opportunity to record in my home and to use my own harpsichord, which is something I was always dreaming of. So, thank you very much. Regarding the program of today's concert, I've been working quite a lot lately on the music surrounding the Bach family. So the books that were copied and studied, and the music that was probably performed at Johann Sebastian Bach's house by himself, by his students, by his sons. And I find the circle of the Bach family, the Bach musical family, very interesting. What I also find worth studying are the sources of Bach's music, who he had in mind as models, who his teachers were, and all the influences that you can find in his music. This is very interesting because we tend to consider Bach, as we do with all great artists, with composers, with painters, with architects, and so forth, as solitary geniuses, if I may say, that create out of nowhere these beautiful works of art. This is, of course, true. Bach was a genius and his music is unique. But as it is often said, he was not an innovator. So it is quite easy, in a sense, and very interesting to look at the music that he took as model and music that he actually imitate. And this is particularly interesting also for German music of the 18th century and even of the 17th century. Now, Germany was, musically speaking, looking for a national style during this period, during what we call the Baroque period. And doing so often imitated styles coming from other nations, particularly from Italy and from France. Coming to a national style later in the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, which is something that we can compare to this kind of goût réuni that Couperin would advocate for. So I start the program with a composition by Scheidemann. Scheidemann was a pupil of Sweelinck in Amsterdam, and he was somehow responsible to import the Flemish keyboard style, and particularly the style of Sweelinck, into Germany. The style of Sweelinck is let's say, it's a very polyphonical style. The voices are treated very clearly throughout the compositions, and yet you have a sense of pure keyboard technique being employed. This you clearly find in Scheidemann's music. I chose to start this program with a beautiful Pavan, which is actually a variation or a diminution on the Dowland Lacrimae setting. And you see that Scheidemann deploys an enormous amount of fantasy in his diminutions, and that you have a sense of a clear use of the keyboard, which is very typical, and we can recognize this style in later music, particularly in the school of North Germany. Parallel to this, you have a great influence of Italian music, particularly in southern Germany. So I chose to include three pieces by Froberger. Froberger was obviously a clear model for Bach, for the young Bach, and particularly for what is called the Stilus Fantasticus, so the free style, which is mostly typical of toccatas. Froberger was lucky enough to be able to travel to Italy and study with the great master of this style, which is Frescobaldi, as well known. So you find most of Frescobaldi's characteristics in Froberger's style, but if I may say, maybe a little more organized than in Frescobaldi. Frescobaldi's music is extremely free and rhapsodic. Froberger organizes a little bit more the rhetorical parts of the speech in the piece, so you can easily recognize a composite piece made by parts in toccata style and then canzonas or polyphonical sections that alternate, which is something that we find clearly quoted in Bach's own toccatas, which are among his most, let's say, interesting young compositions, early compositions. So Froberger was largely responsible for introducing this new free and very virtuosistic style into the German countries. But of course, it doesn't only take those pieces as model with him, but also the great tradition of polyphonical writing for the keyboard. So I wanted to include two contrasting polyphonical pieces. One is a Ricercar. It's one of the shortest Ricercar by Froberger. And I like it very much because it really makes you think of a choir singing a motet, for example, rather than a keyboard, one person, let's say, performing. Every voice is very complete, it's very coherent, it's very singing-like. And I like very much the fact that Froberger's music makes the instrument really sound like a concert or a choir, as I said, rather than one single person playing. And the other piece is a canzona. A canzona is also a polyphonic piece, but rather, let's say, imitating instrumental music, so concert music. Here you clearly see that Froberger uses the theme in different meters, with small interludes in between, which are, again, a quotation of a Stilus Fantasticus. Let's say these different pieces were all digested by the later generations, and they really created what became the great German tradition of preludes and toccatas and so forth. Towards the end of the 17th century, we also see a great influence of French dance music into Germany. So you have, for example, lots of music by Lully being copied and transmitted, and you have many German composers, imitating this style and writing French suites in a slightly German style. So, for example, compared to a French pure composition, let's say, some harmonic patterns will be different, and you often have a sense, an attention to polyphony, which is not so important normally in France. You see traces of these styles throughout Germany, both in the north and in the south. And I chose to include a small suite by Reinken, which is a famous composer of the North German school, together with Buxtehude, for example, who was greatly admired by Bach, and that the young Bach met when he traveled to meet Buxtehude. I find the suite and in general dance music by northern German composers very interesting, because they find a very nice, very interesting balance between French influence, so direct, of course the forms are French, but the writing itself is extremely German, if I may. So you have some very typical German techniques. You will hear, for example, the Allemande has a very specific way of written out arpeggios which work perfectly on a German instrument and would not be so well suited for a French instrument at the same time. So you don't see this kind of writing so regularly in French music. The Sarabande also is extremely German in a very specific cantabile line. And what is also very nice is that to keep the whole suite coherent as a whole, instead of let's say a composition of different separate pieces, Reinken manages to quote melodical material from one movement to the other. So you will hear, for example, the harmonic pattern and very often melodic patterns are used in the same way in the Allemande and in the Courante and so forth, so that the whole suite sounds like a fluid composition of 4 movements rather than 4 small dances put together. Then we move to Kuhnau, which is a composer that I like very much and I try to include as often as I can in my concerts. Kuhnau is one of those composers that unfortunately was living at the same time as much more famous composers. So is unfortunately only known today as the predecessor of Johann Sebastian Bach, as Thomas Cantor in Leipzig, which is of course true. That happened, but we shouldn't forget him in a way for our concerts. He was a very well-known and well-respected composer, and he was an intellectual. So he studied law, he studied rhetoric, he studied languages. He wrote, of course, he published quite a lot of music for keyboard in particular, but he also published a satirical novel, discussing the philosophical and the musical situation of Germany at the time. So he was really, let's say, he was a member of the intellectual community of Central Germany, and I think you can hear this intellectual approach to composing in his music. Kuhnau is somebody that doesn't look for, let's say, revolution, or doesn't accept the last fashion in music. For example, he was against Italian influence, and he clearly says that in his prefaces and in his books. So you wouldn't find direct influence from the opera, which was starting to become very popular in Germany at the time. But rather, he chooses to be coherent with the late 17th century, typically German style. So, for example, in the sonata that I chose, that comes from his third book, the Frische Blumen, so the fresh flowers for keyboard, you see that the sonata is not based on a latest fashion Italian sonata with clearly separate movements, but it's rather a flow of fast and slow parts that really fall into one another, let's say, without interruption. And yet again, he refuses, in a way, this latest fashion of polarizing the writing towards, so giving more importance to the soprano part and the bass part, and leaving the harmonization, let's say, to considering it less interesting. Kuhnau never falls into that and writes fairly polyphonically, and tries to have a very complex harmonic and contrapuntal speech in his music all the time. In this sense, I find Kuhnau is a very good parallel to Johann Sebastian Bach, because we see that Bach, of course, was influenced by Italian, late music, in a sense, by the opera, but he never renounced to his principles of polyphony, of harmonic complexity. And this is particularly true when we consider him in parallel to his friend Telemann. By the way, I wanted to quote Telemann because Telemann got into a quarrel actually with Kuhnau as he was a student in Leipzig. So much so that Kuhnau considered him the cause of his illness and eventually of his death. So I find the relationship between these composers to be quite interesting. We know that Johann Sebastian Bach studied thoroughly the biblical sonatas of Kuhnau, which is his later keyboard book. And I think a lot of the treatment that Bach reserves for chorale melodies can be traced back to Kuhnau. For example, the very famous first choir of the Matthew Passion, I really believe this kind of surprise arrival of the chorale melody into an otherwise fully coherent piece can be traced back to Kuhnau's treatment of such melodies. So Kuhnau is a composer that we should listen to much more often and enjoy because it really brings light into later compositions. Speaking of which, the program ends with a quite famous piece by Johann Sebastian Bach. It's the French Suite in C minor, which I wanted very much to perform and to record. It's a very famous, very extremely beautiful piece that challenges not only performers to because it's quite virtuosistic in a way, it challenges editors very much. It's one of the pieces for which we have more versions, both by Bach and then by later copies. So it was quite complicated actually to choose which version to perform. I finally chose to perform one of the latest versions, and so I decided to include the second minuet, which was not present in the first stage of the piece, let's say, and also to include ornaments that come from later copies, which make some of those passages quite difficult, particularly the Gigue, but I think they are very idiomatic, they're very coherent to what we know from some sources very close to Bach, even from the very young Bach. We have copies of music with a lot of ornaments everywhere. So it must have been somehow at least one of the ways that he was performing. I must say I like very much dealing with difficult scores in the sense scores for which we have many different versions, because this allows us to dig a little bit into the compositional process of Johann Sebastian Bach, which is always very interesting. We are not lucky enough to have this kind of material, this amount of material for all of his works. But for the works that we have in different sources, we also see that let's say, compositions could live parallel lives at different stages. So you would have an early stage of the piece being copied by students and admirers, and then at the same time a later stage, and maybe yet a later stage. And I like very much the fact that very famous pieces that we all perform and that we are all very glad to have could actually be valid. They could be considered valid at different stages at the time. This is very reassuring in a sense, thinking that people like Johann Sebastian Bach, that could really write perfect music, would not consider it as fixed in time, that a certain amount of flexibility of interpretation was allowed, that things could be thought over again and changed. I very much appreciate that, and it allows a certain degree of flexibility on the side of the performer, which I think is very much needed when we are dealing with pieces that we know by heart, either by playing them too often, if you can say too often for this music, or we listen very often too. So maybe the last minute I would like to speak about the instrument that I'm playing. So as I said, I'm very happy to be able to perform in my apartment here in Basel, and that I'm allowed to perform on this beautiful instrument that was just finished. So it's a brand new instrument made by Andrea Ristelli. It's a fantastic builder in Milan. And again, as I appreciate very much flexibility in performance, I also love flexibility when we are speaking of instrument making. This instrument is based on Christian Vater harpsichord, dating from 1738, that is now in Nuremberg, in Germany. The original instrument is a rather small instrument with only 2 8-foot stops that Andrea enlarged to a double, so 2 keyboards with 3 stops, respecting the same proportions. I hope you will like it. I'm totally in love with the instrument. It's very, very powerful and yet very singing. The tones are very long, and the soprano section of both keyboards is very sweet. I like very much the fact that it allows a cantabile line and yet a very precise speech. So you can really think of syllables and consonants when you play. So I thank again very much the festival, and I hope you will enjoy the concert.